Great. Thank you, everyone. Good to be back. I think by virtue of my jet lag and the fact that I've been hosting all day, I think I'm going to be having nightmares about that video. But look, great to be back. We had a really interesting Asia-Pacific FinTech Hub session. Hopefully you caught that, an area obviously dear to my heart, being based out of Hong Kong. But getting back onto a couple of the core themes that we established this morning, one of which you'll recall that the theme of the day, if there's any kind of through line through today, it's this idea of legacy. And I mentioned at the start this morning, legacy, I think, in financial services and in technology tends to refer to technology. People talk about legacy code, legacy systems, and so on. And equally, it tends to have negative connotations. But actually, I want us to think about legacy a little bit differently as well. Firstly, legacy people, legacy processes, but equally the upside of that. I mean, in fact, the advantages of having an established business, having demonstrated viability in the medium term. I mentioned this morning, I'll repeat it now, that I had a session in Singapore last week with what I was referring to as a traditional and non-traditional payments businesses, retail payments businesses. And one of those very well established, very successful traditional businesses corrected me and said, I think by traditional you mean we've demonstrated the ability to make money in the medium term, which was, I think, a bit of a jab at all the innovative companies in the room who had never turned a dime. Anyway, this is going to be a really interesting session. So as I mentioned, we've got the legacy piece, but in addition, what I want to highlight in advance of our next speaker, and we're very lucky to have her, is around adjacent industries, cross industries. Financial services is often quite insular, as are most industries. They focus on what they know and what they already have experience of. But I guess part of this innovation journey, part of the InnoTribe platform here is what can we learn from other industries? Are there lessons we can take? Are there opportunities? So with that in mind, I want to introduce Corporate Vice President from Microsoft. I'm going to double check the name in case I mess it up, but it's Toni Tones Whitley. And if you can please welcome her to the stage. Looking forward to this session. Toni, please.
Thank you. With that intro, I feel the need to do some form of dance step when I get up here. I've been practicing there on the side, but I've been coached not to go there right now. So. Listen, I think this conversation, my role within Microsoft may give you a sense of where I'll go with this discussion. My remit is worldwide industry, and what that means is for all the industries that Microsoft takes to market, whether it be financial services, manufacturing, retail, education, government, health, pharmaceutical, comms, media, I have the opportunity to circumnavigate the globe with customers around what innovation looks like and how our technology can light it up. And so what we're learning is a cross-industry discussion is an interesting one because many industries are learning from others. So if you're going to allow me for a moment, let me just lift and circle and come back to the financial services industry for just a moment in this idea of creating a space for innovation. So let me just take you forward and lift to 2020 and just what we see about what will be happening at that time. Some of the data just to set the tone for what's going forward. People generating massive amounts of data, unprecedented opportunities for innovation, just the number of devices and how much data each individual will create. That gives us a sense of both the, if you will, comprehensive feel for the future, but also the complexity that will go with it. This idea about human jobs and cobot, which is the collaboration between human and robot. We spend a lot of time in manufacturing and retail talking about the cobot experience. The fact that second to last bullet, the average person having more conversations with a bot than a human, my husband's personal favorite, I'm not taking it personally. This is the 2020 view that's lifted to just set the stage. So let me lift you up. And now let's talk about what's needed to create space for innovation. You know, at Microsoft, for 43 years, we've had an amazing legacy, an amazing platform, an amazing set of performance. And yet, we've been spending time with neuroscientists, people like Dr. Carol Dweck, to shift our mindset. And here's what we've learned about innovation. 4 things required to shift your mindset. You probably know some of them. First, quiet. Second, internally focused, not externally distracted. Third, might find interesting, slightly positive. So all of the negative folks in the audience, innovation is created with a slight, not an overly enthusiastic, but a slightly positive mindset. And fourth, when you're not thinking directly about the problem. So anybody who has innovation hour during your day, at 3 o'clock I'm going to innovate around my platform, let me just let you know, that doesn't consistently work with the neuroscience research. So that's why we look across industries and then across different areas to understand what innovations are occurring. So I'm going to ask you to do all four with me. I'd like you to be slightly positive. One, personally, it makes me feel better if you smile at me. And some of you are not there yet. I just want to highlight some in the back I won't name. I want you to focus on how what you're hearing addresses your day-to-day and make some translations. We're going to stay a little bit quiet, and we're not going to think directly about every problem in financial services. We're also, if you don't mind, we're going to use a little bit of the frame that Microsoft is using, because we're a framework kind of company. In addition to being a platform company, we need to think in frames. And the way we frame the transformation that is powered by innovation for our customers is in this 4x4 frame. We frame it on the 4 verticals around the way we now package our products into solution areas, so that we're not doing transactional license-based selling of products, but fundamentally driving towards solutions. And we all look at the outcomes in terms of a digital transformation journey for our customers. You can see the journey around how do we empower the employees? How do they engage with their customers differently? How do we change or optimize the infrastructure, the operational infrastructure, which can usually be quite costly? And then finally, what does that full business model transformation look like of products and services? If you look here, for example, we do this by an industry view. So within government, we would do this by talking about how does Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs Tax Authority, how do they look to empower their employees? And I'll come back there. For customers, we might look, if you will, at Carlsberg, at one of the 4th largest breweries around the world. What are they doing for customer experience? When we think about optimizing operations, we think of a retailer, an online retailer, that's really geared at a very young market, but has an amazing set of transactions in an e-commerce platform. And when we think about transforming products in a business model, we think about this legacy company, ThyssenKrupp, elevator company, that is moving into innovations so far beyond people movement in a traditional elevator to stair lift and all other forms of people movement with a brand new business model. So that's how we sort of think about it. So let me just give you a moment on each as I deep dive. Let's go to the UK for a minute in the tax authority. Let me just give you a couple of the details here. So let's talk about the UK tax authority, 56,000 employees. This is in an area that when we did a CIO study for the UK of what digital transformation looked like a couple of years ago, the only area that was not judged highly in the top 10 was employee. We were digitally transforming to customers, B2B, G2B, C2C, but we had nothing related to the employee experience. And so this is an interesting conversation about how this transformation occurred. They were using paper-based systems to do all forms of, if you will, inspection of oil and tax, and this is called the Oil Real-Time Challenge application. We provided Surface, Windows Office 365, and now these audit capabilities are in a single touch, single system, paperless, end-to-end. Handwriting is done with our facial recognition and other forms of AI, and all the way through we have a seamless operation for their employees. Employees sat up, all the interim steps of the business process collapsed, and a full innovation of the employee experience. Now, let me move you to a customer experience conversation. What are we going to learn from a beer maker? What are we going to learn about, if you will, their moment of truth? They decided as the 4th largest brewery that they needed to do something to drive their customer experience. Maybe some of you all know about trying to capture the customer experience. They call it the moment of truth. And they put all of their data science around capturing this moment of truth. Now, anybody drink beer? It's okay, because you're not taped. I am, thank you. And so for the beer drinkers, what's the moment of truth you think they were capturing? Just let me know. What do you think was the moment of truth, Carl? The first beer, love it. First beer, anyone else? The second beer. Okay, so obviously we have some of the deeper beer drinkers here, or on the velocity of beer drinking. Anything else on the moment of truth? What would they define it as? This moment of truth that drives their customer experience. I didn't hear you. Just repeat it for me so I can say it up. Returning to drink it again. So a lot of beer recapture and renewal going on here in the audience as we look at beer. Let's listen. Let's roll the tape on Carlsberg on this customer experience.
Carlsberg Group is one of the leading brewing companies across the world. We are distributing beer across 150 markets, and we are number one and number two in all the markets that we have decided to play with. The overall ambition for Carlsberg in terms of a digital platform is to enable us to have a full 360 view of our customers. We are analyzing what we call the moment of truth, making sure that we know exactly when and how they are deciding to drink a beer, so we can influence that decision at the right time, with the right device, in the right channel. The way we want to support, from a technology point of view, this digital journey is by gathering information, enabling IoT, by being able to store them massive amount of volume into data lakes, and then, of course, making sense of them by using technologies such as artificial intelligence.
We use Azure in a bimodal approach. Number one, we use it for our traditional data centers to deliver the rock-solid capabilities that is required in that space. But on the other hand, we also use Azure as an innovation platform. The benefits of Azure in terms of IT security are going to be threefold. We can actually ensure that the data are well protected and under our control. We can ensure that our intellectual property is secured. And finally, we can leverage tools like the directory in order to have and secure the employees that are going to access our innovation platform.
The outcome of using all those technology is about really getting a one-to-one interaction with every customer, because this is exactly where we need to be. We need to not only follow those trends, we need to lead those trends.
So that moment of truth, knowing exactly where people are, what they're doing, what's influencing their decision to buy a beer. And all of the technology you heard was a legacy platform, of which Azure was the selected platform to drive cognitive services, predictive analytics, IoT-enabled sensors to start to get through and understand how to triangulate around that customer experience. That is one of the examples of how we're driving innovation in that, if you will, consumer packaged goods space. Let me move also then to ASOS. How many people know of ASOS? Just give me a show of hands. I want you to know why it's so cool that you raised your hand. Because ASOS is an online retailer that is totally focused on capturing the online retail market for 20-somethings. So I'm sure all of the youthful people in the room know all about ASOS. What's interesting about ASOS, as we learn about this type of innovation, they did an infrastructure, they looked at their infrastructure for supporting an e-commerce platform. Why was it important? Because you can look at the numbers, 13.4 million customers, 85,000 products on their site, 4,500 going live every week. If I have any product managers in the room and you're dealing with those types of numbers, this is why they were looking for an e-commerce platform with Microsoft. They transformed it by putting it and running on the cloud with Azure. And what's interesting about this, if you look at their monthly pull, more transactional volume than Amazon retail on a monthly basis, just to give you a sense of how many transactions they're running. This is the impact that they had by putting that e-commerce platform on one of the strongest, most robust platforms on the planet, and this 25% revenue growth for being able to absolutely segment content directly for their customer base. ThyssenKrupp, that was my last example of, and if you remember the digital journey, we've gone through employees, customers, the infrastructure, and the last was the product. this product innovation. But I would argue this is a business model innovation with ThyssenKrupp. ThyssenKrupp, we started with them talking about elevator service with their employees, how to do predictive maintenance with artificial intelligence for their employees, for elevators. I'd like to quickly let you see what we're talking about now.
ThyssenKrupp builds stair lifts, but staircases are all unique, and that makes it very hard to find one stair lift which fits all. Each and every stair lift needs to be customized to make a perfect fit. A chairlift allows our customers to access all floors of their home and be mobile in their own environment.
Selling, manufacturing, and then installation, it all takes quite a while. People need a quick solution. With Hololens, we started saying, let's look how we can measure stairs differently so it's quicker.
Microsoft Hololens is a fully self-contained wearable holographic computer. It enables you to interact with your digital content and projects high-definition 3D holograms into the world all around you.
Once we got the hand on the HoloLens, it was an eye-opener for us. You just put the HoloLens on and then you scan the staircase and then start to measure every step. HoloLens guides you through the process.
But that was just the very beginning. We realized that the HoloLens is not just another methodology of measuring a staircase, but is actually performing digital data capturing to the cloud.
With the Azure cloud, we are actually able to transport all the data gathered by the HoloLens to our customer database and our accounting systems in real time and forward it to the manufacturing site where you start production. That is a completely new use. Delivering a product with HoloLens, we could become up to 4 times faster.
We can show the animation like, hey, this is your personal stair lift. With the HoloLens, we can provide that solution faster and it will actually make the customer's life better. We're getting more and more connected with each other, right? And the HoloLens will play a major role in this connectivity.
There's plenty of potential, and whomever we discuss this with comes up with a new idea, and that's what's so great about it.
With this partnership with Microsoft, ThyssenKrupp will transform homes to make life better. That is a game changer.
Look, some of us in the room are in a sandwich generation. We have children in the 20-something ASOS retailer space. We have parents in this stair lift space. And so one of the things we talk about with legacy is the innovations for a ThyssenKrupp is now creating a new business model around being able to capture data with a HoloLens and go directly to production. There is no middle step. That's the 4 times increase. So that's when we start talking about innovation. What can we learn from different industries that influence where we sit in financial services? One of the things that we're spending a bit of time on is this case for looking at the effect of digital natives, those companies that were born in the cloud, most recently, that come into the space, into the industry as digital natives. In this space, you might call them some of the fintechs, but every industry has digital natives. And you can see that the digital natives are capturing their share and more of the market space. There's a way that they're doing that we believe applies to every company. Every company, and every company can have a leapfrog into this market share. We call this the digital feedback loop. And what that fundamentally means that every company has at its core, at its root of innovation, a virtuous cycle of 2 forms of signal. Signals from product and product telemetry, signals from customers and customers' feedback. It is in the integration of these loops and the willingness to move in a viral fashion with this data that we see the greatest increase for a company. Let me give you 2 examples. Netflix. I've given you ASOS, I'll come back to it. Netflix. We all know the Netflix story. We know what was the, if you will, intrusion and disruption into the video rental space, into streaming. But do we know the steps of that story that took a recommendation engine that was built in that disruption and really got keen on data on customer preference? So keen that Netflix then went into the next loop of providing and starting to establish content that they were then able to focus on their customers. As they started to gain new customers, they started to gain new data. This is the loop that we're talking about, the signals. And so you can see as just one example, I could have put a customer sat example for Netflix. There are so many different measures to say how successful they've been. This is just one that looks at Emmy nominations and how quickly they've captured that market in a very short period of time over traditional providers. ASOS, the same thing. Personalized customer experience, content fully curated to a very specific customer set. That knowledge captured, product telemetry integrated, and then on the platform, they made a change to go to Azure to a platform to help drive the e-commerce platform, and you see the revenue results. This is what we learn cross-industry, that digital feedback loops are going to be what's necessary for companies to accelerate. Look, I asked you to let me take us around the world. Thank you for that. I asked you to let me take you cross-industry. Thank you for that. I'm coming back. I do know the name of the conference is Sibos. I have a sense of what you all do for a living. Let's come back to financial services for a moment. What we've learned on the financial services innovation is a very small part of your budget is actually earmarked for innovation. If we're honest with ourselves, most of the IT spend, even the COG spend, is often about feeding the beast of the basic platforms and legacy kinds of applications and infrastructure that you have. And so we know that it's a small part. So the question is, how then do we get the most out of that innovation budget? And what can we do? We're also learning as we look at what's happening around the world in FinServe that we have an opportunity. We start to connect the dots between an interesting correlation on personal data. That first quote I find phenomenal. Remember, I serve in regulated markets across government. I deal with highly secure institutions and enterprises, and it's interesting to see the supply-demand curve starting to shift. We're looking to see how much is this related to generational shift, but this willingness to offer up more personal data for value-added services as long as they're customized. Interesting for retail banking. Interesting for insurers on what the real cost savings on the COGS model can be with different forms of infrastructure. And then interesting on this collaboration between fintech and enterprise financial institution. It's because of that last one and some of the data that we're capturing around the feedback loop that Microsoft is very focused on bringing these two communities together. In fact, I would argue that our definition of innovation right now is how to bring these two entities together. And we have some examples here. But let me just start with, we've launched something called a startups team. That's about identifying the startups and carrying them through not only the Microsoft portfolio, but how do they engage within this industry? How do we get their innovation on our platform? And how do they go forward with great speed and agility with you? So if you're on the left side and you're bringing the base, a historical base, regulatory expertise, a customer set. If you're on the right side and perhaps you're bringing an innovative, smaller base, but an innovative platform, an innovative set of IP, our goal right now is to drive that engagement with our platforms as quickly as possible. A couple of the examples of how we're doing that. You'll hear, some of you may have seen some of the workshops there. We've got one around, if you will, PayKey, which is an app that provides social network platforms matched to many enterprise banks. This is about an application being able to drive financial services from any application on any app platform called PayKey. The second one that we've also talked about, you'll hear about, and I think Satya, our CEO, will speak about when he speaks to this audience in a couple of days, will be around our partnership with Blue Prism and identity. And we've teamed up to streamline, if you will, for an anti-money laundering solution that we are demonstrating here, a blockchain solution with our AI capability. If you haven't had a chance to stop by that session, I would ask for you to take a look at what we're doing. This is about bringing fintech innovation on our platform to scale and accelerate in the enterprise space. So lastly, let me just say that this conversation is around innovation. This conversation is around each of you individually making space in your personal lives, in your professional lives, in your institutions, in your organizations to innovate. Innovation doesn't just happen. You have to make space for it. I gave you 4 personal ways to make space for it at the beginning of this. Hopefully you've taken those away. Get personal, focus in, stay quiet, don't think about the problem you're trying to address. how we innovate personally. But organizationally, the question is, what are we going to change, and how are we going to drive this kind of innovation? And with that, I believe we're going to have a little bit of a dialogue here as we go forward. Some questions and answers. Is that great? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Yep.
If you wouldn't mind.
Pass you this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to take a seat,
Sure,
Tony,
I'll
I'm
do
going to thank you very much, Tony, for that very interesting presentation, which I think we're going to dive into in a bit more detail now. If I can ask Saket Sharma from BNY Mellon to join us up front as well. Here you go, Saket. Perhaps, Saket, I can ask you to do a quick introduction.
Sure.
Oh, if you can do a quick introduction, after which I think there's a couple of questions maybe that we can get the discussion started. I'm very keen as we progress to take questions from the floor as well.
Sure. So I am responsible for a line of business technology within BNY Mellon called as Treasury Services, responsible for payments, electronic banking, supply chain, and liquidity services. I am also responsible for the financial network integration for the bank. I also run a group called as Emerging Technology and Businesses, which is predominantly right now focused on blockchain and the future technologies.
So a lot of different hats.
A lot of different hats.
Okay, great. So I think maybe if we can, again, as I said up at top, the objective here is really to try and learn across industries and take some of the lessons, some of the challenges, some of the constraints. I mean, I think, if you don't mind, Tony, just for me to start around, I was struck by a couple of the quotes on the screen there, in particular the Accenture one about, I guess, 67% of customers would share more data in exchange for a better service. I mean, whether it applies to consumer, finance, or others, I mean, personally, I'm of the view that consumers don't know what data they're sharing today. Are they really in a position to say that they would share more? And I guess the question I'm coming to, because I think this has big implications for the technology industry as well as financial services, are we moving towards greater transparency of consumer or retail data exchange, or are we moving to greater opacity in that space? I mean, can you speak to maybe some of the trends about data ownership and data?
Sure. I'll start off, and please join me here. A lot of that, what we're finding, particularly in the automotive industry, let me go to manufacturing for a moment, which is interesting. There's a corollary quote that goes along with the Accenture quote that will speak to what drivers are willing to offer up to get value-added services from their cars or their automobiles. We're finding in manufacturing and retail this willingness to exchange, as long as the service is personalized and they see value, this trade-off of how much I'm willing to offer. And usually it is not the sort of intrinsic knowledge of I know where all my data is and I know what I'm offering. It's more I see the service, you tell me what it costs to get the service. So let's look at the supply side driving that more than the demand side driving that, with more value-added service, whether that is in retail at point of sale, in automotive, with here are the new packages for, if you will, semi-connected or autonomous driving. That is usually the pitch is the supply side that then influences how much am I willing to lever on personal data in exchange for that. So I just want to make sure that we're not suggesting that we have a set of informed consumers that all know their data portfolio and are all really astute at out there in some kind of marketplace for data. No, they're looking at value-added services and some of the innovations, and they're responding to that in the, as a consumer looking at that supply.
Okay, I mean, that's a really interesting perspective, and I think coming from, to bring it over to you, Saket, I mean, how I think of that, and I'm not sure I mentioned at the start, I run EY's fintech capability in Asia Pacific. I'm based in Hong Kong. We spend a lot of time in China. And, you know, if we're to think about retail fintech, actually mainland China is far and above the rest of the world when it comes to adoption and innovation. And there's myriad factors for that, but certainly one of the drivers, and we've done longitudinal studies to suggest that there's actually very little expectation around data privacy in China. In fact, the expectation doesn't exist. The regulations are not as stringent as we would have here in Canada or elsewhere. And I think as a consequence, they've been able to innovate, they've been able to build products. There are other factors, as I mentioned, as well. I guess I'm trying to figure out, Tony, absolutely agree that it would be very difficult to get to a marketplace of fully informed consent. So is there a middle ground between, you know, the age-old, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product? Or is there a middle ground to get to a point at which we are in a position to relinquish certain aspects of our data in order to get more personalized financial services?
So I think I'll talk more on the wholesale side, but I'll just add to the point what she was making, which was, oftentimes we look at innovation outside. Sometimes innovation is within your own house. You got to look at it. And the perfect example is data. Financial services, if everybody looks into their organizations, we collect tremendous amount of data. Are we really capitalizing on the data what we have to provide value-added services? To me, something everybody has to ask that question. And to me, that's the first fundamental thing you can do as an organization, because you own the data at a large extent. You own that IP, right? You want to provide value-added services on top of the data, which is probably your IP and algorithms like machine learning, predictive analytics, because at the end of the day, what customer is looking for is value. Now, coming back to your question around what happens to data privacy, I think that depending upon what jurisdiction you are operating under, there are different ways in which you are restricted, what you can share, what you cannot share. Clearly, on the wholesale side, it's a different ball game altogether versus retail. And oftentimes, when customers are first given a picture of when they are logging onto an application, there's a very fine print around the data. Nobody reads about it when you do agreement, right? And usually you share more data than you typically do. But I think so the level of privacy also depends on where you are located, how much you can share, and what are the restrictions you need to operate into. Mm-hmm. But you need to also look at that as a basis. You are holding customers' data. You're holding their trust. You need to ensure that their data is protected, right? So you need to think about innovation not in just terms of product and services, but in ensuring that new services are offering to protecting the data as well. Because as in the digital age, the amount of data that you're creating is 10 times more than what you used to do with Internet of Things coming into picture. So everything is actually creating data now. In the past, it was only systems. Now, if you have to collect all these data together, you're talking about massive amount of data. So you need to think about how you're going to really manage that data effectively. Sure. And really get to the next level of value creation.
And let me just add to that. I think one of the things we have to be careful about when we start talking about supply-demand around data, and we know it's currency, we see it going forward. One of the things I have been really impressed in my sort of 30 months at Microsoft, and I use this an unabashed compliment to the company around being principled before you move into this discussion. Having principles and structured, codified principles around trust. This idea that trust is now an asset. It's an asset. When I deal with governments are looking to ensure trust with their citizens. Our customers want trust from the technology. So we're realizing that a portfolio of trust assets are important. And principles around that, around security, around privacy, around transparency, around compliance, that you have to start with that. You can't wait till you're in the space and start to sort of backfill those boxes. And so I think one of the things we're looking at is, as consumer demand may shift, even as enterprise demand may shift, we're leaning in heavily on AI. Brings all kinds of conversations about trust and how far. You equally have to then almost reinforce your principled approach. Yep. And it is not just privacy, it is transparency. We're finding the new word for privacy is sometimes transparency. People want to know, they feel better about privacy or the trade-offs if transparency is coupled with it. Yep. We feel better about transparency if compliance and certs are coupled with it. And so it's not a single dimension. And in the financial, there's probably no industry that is keener on this issue of trust than this industry. For sure. Health and financial services, I would argue, from a consumer perspective, and even quite frankly from a societal perspective, are totally focused on this. Love to see this industry actually take the leadership on this conversation around trust assets if data is fundamentally going to be the currency going forward.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, Tony, and it's often said that, financial services, health, and maybe adding education into that are the most difficult industries to disrupt in a way because of the genuine personal and familial concerns in relation to that. I mean, I'm hoping we can get to a couple of questions from the audience, perhaps on that front. One final question for me, I guess, in relation to cloud. I think, as with all technologies, we've kind of been through the hype cycle a little bit, but I think people are coming back to, actually, this is quite transformational. Personally, an ex-startup guy, I've seen one of the biggest drivers of the fintech moment, as I see it, has just frankly been access to computing power, has been access to analytics, has been the ability for the three of us now to decide, hey, we're going to go start our own business, and we could actually spin something up in the morning. That, for me, and we're only at the beginning of this journey, I think, has been quite transformational. Now, will it have, I guess my question is, what's the relative impact of cloud on new companies unencumbered by legacy?
Yeah.
So the three of us deciding to do our own thing, or some of the larger businesses or some of the big corporates. I mean, how easy is it for a BNY Mellon or for a larger corporate across industry to really take advantage of the scalability inherent in cloud infrastructure?
I can take that.
Sure.
So that's a really good question. So in my view, you can't look at cloud, blockchain, artificial intelligence, robotics, and say this technology is going to change me. They have to be all part of your digital strategy. And if you are looking at digital strategy, every organization is different. So it's not that one size fits all kind of thing. But predominantly, there are three major pillars that we thought of were very important: people, product, and platforms. People are very important for innovation, right? When you have a different mindset when you are actually talking about digital transformation, you really are focusing the traditional way of software development from application-centric to product-centric. So there's a huge shift in the thinking process that you have to bring in when you talk about leveraging these technologies, right? The second thing becomes this product mindset, right? As digital feedback. Mm-hmm. Well, as a best practice, you should always get feedback from your clients, regardless of whether it's digital or not, right? So it's always the case that you always want to vet out your ideas upfront with the clients. The cost structures are going, you have to do quick time to market piece. The new technologies have enabled us to do that much quicker,
yeah.
Whether you do agile or not, right? Typically in the past, you had waterfall models. You still used to do that, but it was not fast enough to adapt to the market changes. And last but not the least, if you don't have the platform, which basically means you need to have a cloud, you need to have your data part of the equation, you need to have APIs, how you are going to consume, others will consume your APIs, how you will consume those capabilities out, you are not going to be quick enough to adapt. So culturally, I think so all these three things makes a huge difference in how you look at your digital strategy.
And sorry, before we come on to term, but do they benefit, that combination of factors, does that benefit smaller, I mean, I know this is a pretty macro question, does that benefit smaller businesses or larger ones who have
I think it benefits all, actually, okay. In my view, because if you look at large companies like us, we also have a private cloud, right? We are seeing the benefits internally as well. So it's much easier. I always give an example. If you were trying to do software development, let's say 10, 15 years back, right? And you will say, I need to develop a new product. I'll basically go and put a requisition for a new infrastructure, right? It will take some time before it gets deployed in the data center. I need to configure it out. And then I have that app dev piece which needs to go on top of it. Yeah. The cycle of that has really shortened out because now you are actually on a cloud. On demand, you can provision a VM or something else to really deploy your app. And so you're focused more on the app development versus figuring out the underlying piece, what you need to do. So that really enables not only large companies, but small companies where they may not have the infrastructure, but they can just go and lease somewhere very quickly and deploy their core asset, which is the work that they're doing from a fintech perspective.
And I guess I would say to that, our theme here is legacy, and this idea that legacy is not a bad word. We're not your grandfather's legacy organization. I think this idea that large companies can move in an agile way with cloud technologies is absolutely proven out for us. When I look at some of the huge, if you will, logos that Microsoft has been working with, the challenge has never been whether they can move. The challenge has been in the dimensions in which they move, which is why we've broken it into those 4 dimensions I highlighted. Because you can start with your employees, or you can start with your customers, or you can look at your platform, or you can talk about a business model innovation. Generally, the transformation requires for you to start to move across that continuum. And whether you're a small company that may not be encumbered by quite maybe the legacy platform, you still may not have a significant customer base or a significant brand recognition. So every company's dealing with something. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we really believe, and we've seen it, the large volumes of data that can be analyzed and move us in a predictive space are taking us from what I would say first domain, second domain of knowledge, right? What I know, what I don't know, to the third domain, what I don't know that I don't know. it is that predictive capability of iteratively learning from the data in these feedback loops that are setting companies on a different path. And it doesn't matter if you're a startup or if you're a traditional 200-year-old company, learning in that third domain, your employees learning, your product learning, your platform learning and growing with you with machine learning, that is what we see as the new horizon.
Yeah, I completely agree to that. I think that the model of predictive to prescriptive, that's where I think so you will see a huge shift, whether it's a startup.
We're getting into the Donald Rumsfeldian known unknowns, unknown unknowns. I mean, I've not been able to read the clock all day. Have we got time for questions? We do have time for questions. Great. Any questions from the audience for two really excellent guests? I'm sure there's some, well, I hope there's some interesting questions. Gosh, we're getting to that time of day where people are unwilling to raise their hand. Great, this gentleman at the front.
Sir?
As a beer drinker, I don't want Heineken following me. I mean, it's a bit Big Brother, and that's kind of creepy. And I think the question about 67% of the people being willing to turn over data for extra services. I mean, maybe I'm old school and that millennial generation is happy, but even they, I think, are starting to look at data and wondering if they've made right decisions at a very young age. Yeah. So I'm just more of a comment about data and customers and the future. It sounds grand, but I'm just wondering if there's going to be some pushback soon on some of the things. More of a macro comment, I guess.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting comment, not to dwell on the specifics, but in relation to, for me, a big driver I mentioned of the fintech moment, if you like, innovation, and that has been access to analytics, but it's also been regulatory change. Mm-hmm. The reality is financial services over the past 10 years has had a lot of regulatory change, some of it good, some of it bad, depending on where you sit. But in any event, one of the big drivers is either as a fintech, perhaps regulatory arbitrage, as an incumbent, increased penalties, whatever it might be. I think on the data point, to bring it back to this gentleman's point, do we feel that the next 5-10 years is going to see change about how we as consumers conceive of data, but then equally up a level, regulators, national regulators thinking about data? I know it's a difficult question. It's not, but
no,
looking
I think
forward.
it's a fair one because I think it's and Carlsberg will be thrilled that you don't want Heineken to do that because that will work well for them. So, but I hear you. And look, we have 4 generations in the workforce. And so first we have to acknowledge, wherever you fall on that continuum, you and I probably fall in the same spot, and that's okay. I know where we are. But there are 4 generations in the workforce. And I think as well as we have cultural dimensions, as we talk about regulation and the view of privacy in China versus so one of the things as a global, as a global player like Microsoft, we have to look at that entire continuum as well as the whole globe. And so there are differences, to be fair. I think we all hear feedback about the concern of whether it's artificial intelligence, the introduction of bots and bot frameworks, what happens with data, what does that mean for the human experience? Do I feel like I'm being tracked? Is my job being taken away? It goes the full cycle. And look, I think there's some data that goes both ways about that. We are encouraged that we see an augmented human reality, not a replaced human reality. That is what we're building towards, the augmented. So that's a position that you take. Remember, I go back to being principled as a company. We had that position before the technology was being built. So that's where we're going. But I think this conversation about will we see something different on the regulation? Interesting enough, you look at the EU and the, if you will, data protection work that's coming out of that. Lots of increasing regulation for companies, as I know where everybody's getting ready for May of next year, to ensure that we can all hit GDPR and the data privacy. We're seeing right to not be audited, right to exit a database, right to be informed. We see a lot of increase in Europe, which I think will spill over to other areas, as we've seen, on, if you will, privacy protection. So I think what you're going to see is a bit of a curve. The technology will allow for more data collection, quicker data analysis, and more data, if you will, envisioning. The regulatory, if we believe that GDPR and other sort of EU may push the other way, you'll see a great focus on ensuring the privacy and the data of citizens around the world, particularly in the PubSec. What will be interesting to see is how commercial sector deals with GDPR, how public sector deals with GDPR, and where that balance is.
Yep.
But I think there's some countervailing motions that I'm actually somewhat pleased to see in place, because I think it keeps a little bit of a check and balance to your concern.
Great. Any gentleman back here?
As we talk about data, I sometimes have the impression that we're talking about knowing everything. And I wonder whether in the planning and in the whole of this you factor in an unknowable and how big it is. Because there must be things that you have to allow for the possibility that you've missed something. I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment, but I just think we're assuming rather a lot of discovery.
Yeah. I respond to it this way. I love the push on that, the intellectual push, which is let's not assume false precision in data collection that somehow we've captured enough data to either predict a circumstance or to respond to a circumstance or to suggest that we have full knowledge of some entity or organization. I think that's fair. What I see organizations doing cross-industry is really focusing in, almost think of it as a segmentation of data that matters to their specific outcome. They're actually graying out lots of data. There's so much data. I think one stat I could have shown, which you would have fought me on and thrown things at me, which is an MIT recent stat that says, I'm sorry, I don't even know what MIT stands for. Do we have to say it out here? Thank you, Institute of Technology in Cambridge. Their stat says that 0.5 of 1%, half of 1% of data is actually being used and analyzed, which is an interesting. So as much as we get excited about data as currency, the reality is that we're not doing huge data dives and huge deep. We don't have the full landscape of data, and most organizations come at the data segmented on what they want to drive their business outcome, and they gray out the rest. So I think that might work against this sort of we may be precision about the outcome we're looking for, but I don't think it suggests that people actually want the full realm of data. They might want machines to get faster in helping them see what data should matter. And that's the predictive piece of what they should be looking at.
And Tony, and sorry, before we get in on that, as a corollary to the statement or question, I thought it was interesting you opened with the idea that in order to foster innovation, you needed these, I guess it was these 4 conditions.
Yes, these personal. Yeah.
But as you went through them, which I really enjoyed, by the way, I thought it was a great way of prefacing it. As you went through them, I realized, how many of us have quiet time? When was the last time? Well, I have kids as well, but we are constantly pestered by or pestering ourselves with technology. Mm-hmm. I can't recall the last time I wasn't reading something, scrolling through something, doing something, just taking a moment to contemplate. Is this because? So I think it's an interesting challenge to all of us. Do we see, and maybe this is getting a little bit, I wonder, will there be at some stage a bit of a pushback against all of the data, against all of the technology? In the same way we've had the slow food movement, are we likely to have the put your phone away movement? Are we likely to say IoT and everything actually sounds vaguely dystopian?
Yeah. There was a wonderful book written several years ago, a Harvard business professor, called In Over Our Heads, which was about, we assumed with every inflection point of technology that it would get easier and faster and streamlined. In fact, we cobbled on to the point where people feel overwhelmed by opportunities. In fact, some of us feel like we live in a scatter plot, and each day we're running sort of regression analysis of what's critical because we could do so many options. If we go back the 100 years that I can go back in my life, when I started, there were a very few number of data points, and it was all about envisioning. We had 3 channels on the and you were envisioning. It wasn't 4,000 channels and you were choosing. It was all envisioning. So we do have a shift, and remember, we're all in the workforce from that whole continuum. One thing you said kids, I have 5 kids and 4 grandkids, and I will tell you, you notice that even parents and families trying to create time to shut down that input and find opportunity to be bored. Because out of boredom, what used to be called boredom, which we've taken away as a generation because no one's bored, so we've got 4 million things to do, but boredom drove some innovation,
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's why I started with something that doesn't seem appropriate for a corporate audience. Why would we talk about personal innovation and personal space? Because the corporation is made up of humans. And if humans don't find space for innovation, collectively we don't find space for innovation. So that's why I start there, because I think we have to think about, it's not about innovating at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. That's just not how your body works, how your mind works, and I think if you're going to be open to some of these concepts, you've got to get yourself ready.
Yeah, I agree. I just wanted to respond back to the gentleman's question around, so there was a meeting which was broadcasted on Bloomberg with the vice chairman for Fed talking about, should we go towards a rule-based system where we increase the interest rates? And I think so he was trying to argue on your point that you can't always go by algorithms which are being slated as KPIs based on which you make decisions. You always have to factor in the unknowns. Nobody knew you are going to have 3 hurricanes side by side coming and hitting United States, and that's going to impact the economy in some shape or form. So that has to be considered across the board when you think about data. You will find new things. You have to assume that, because if you don't, then you are not going to really be looking at it with an open mind. Because otherwise you already have something in your mind and you're trying to dig back into the data to really validate your hypothesis. And you don't want to do that. You probably want to go with more open mind. You might find some solutions which you may not even be thinking about at that point. So having that openness is always going to be important when you look at data.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I think we have time for one or perhaps 2 more questions. Anyone in the audience a question for the panel?
My beer guy.
Back for seconds.
Saket, can you tell me, is it Nexen? Is that your innovation?
Yeah.
That's your umbrella? And how is it going? Is it working? And what are you trying to accomplish as a bank with that? And is it a model another bank might be interested to co-op or incorporate in their own innovative efforts?
So I think it's every bank has to think what works for them. It's not like one solution fits all, as I mentioned before. But I think so what we have done is we basically have laid out the foundation and the strategy and the platform, and every line of business is in their journey to adapt to that thing. And we also have legacy and the modern thing. We are trying to really see the balance and really focus on what's the value we are trying to generate for the customers, just purely going to a digital platform, because going to digital platform is one thing, but really creating value out of what you are providing as capabilities is far more important in my view. So I think so every line of business is thinking from their perspective. But imagine when you have a large technology workforce and you want all of them to really think the same way, you need to have a platform, right? Because you often end up creating the same capabilities in silos, knowingly or unknowingly, and then you end up into that big thing which is like duplication all over the place. You really want to avoid that. And that's why, having a standard platform, governance around the platform really helps you to leverage and provide that integration aspect quicker. Because what today's fintechs do is they are masters in integration, right? And we can learn a lot from them as to, you don't need to build everything from scratch, but how you can quickly integrate and provide the solutions to the customers, that's the key. That's why, in our platform, we say, fintechs can play a role, and we can combine those capabilities together and provide to our customers. That becomes a key aspect. So it's a journey. It's not like, you're going to reach it tomorrow. Things change, but, everybody is then on our path. In Treasury Services, what I run, we are on a path. We've released a lot of APIs, capabilities out. We've learned a lot through this journey, and we are adapting because, the customers give us feedback, we incorporate it out, and build our products better the next time.
So, going to wrap up. I'm going to put you both on the spot just to close out by asking a question. I mean, I'm kind of dispositionally of the view that all industries are technology industries. They just don't know it yet. Who do you think, asking both of you in turn, what industries are likely to see the most genuine disruption, by which I really mean destruction, in the next 5, 10, 20 years? Putting you both on the spot. So whoever wants to. I mean, we've seen
Definitely
media.
start with
We've
my
seen
colleague. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I don't call it disruption in financial services. I think there will be transformation in the financial services industry. And technologies
and will that be new players coming in, or will it be existing players transforming themselves? I think
it's a combination, but the overall ecosystem will get transformed, in my view. And that will happen because of the technology advancements and everything. Disruption is a very abstract word in my view. 2 years back, in Cybos, people saying correspondent banking is going to go away, right? Fintechs will take over. There will be no banks existing. Well, we are here, and I think so we rolled out GPI capabilities out, and it's there. So you have to try to solve a customer problem rather than talking about the disruption piece. And there's always a space for fintechs. There's always a space for financial services. We just need to figure out how we collaborate and work together. Because fintechs bring great technology. What banks need is a lot of regulatory wisdom, and the capabilities, if combined together, could be really meaningful for the entire industry.
Okay. Tony?
Yeah, I may cheat and say too. Look, I probably see the fastest disruption curves in manufacturing, particularly around discrete process manufacturing. Automotive, I could pull out. The integration of information technology and operational technology have such an impact on the COGS model for these institutions and the sort of Industrial 4.0 transformation of the manufacturing plant floor, their logistics systems around that, as well as the supply chain, is just moving really, really fast. And they're adopting AI or artificial intelligence in all forms. So I would say on the manufacturing front, I see it in discrete and process significantly. At the same time, it's interesting to watch what's occurring on the retail side. I look at the transformation of this augmented reality by having so much of the retail experience driving there. I wouldn't even call it as much a disruption. It's people jumping on the train to move faster and faster and faster in the retail space. So those are the two, I think, when I think of just the curve and the pace of the new technology that's going to kind of push us and introduce new. The appetite for this technology is just so deep in that space, in the competitive. And yet, it is still my hope, and I still believe that on the trust discussion, on every tough discussion in technology, this industry sits right at the vortex.
Yeah.
How far do you go with AI?
Yeah.
What does it look like in terms of data and privacy? How far do you want to engage with what is still considered maybe the most trusted relationship with people's assets, their future, their wealth? And in some ways, I see this industry as setting the next bar of what is the appropriate place for us to be with technology. Not all that we can do, but all that we should do. It's in the can and should conversation that I lean in on the financial services industry to lead that.
I think that's a fantastic place to finish. Please join me in thanking both Tony and Saket for their time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Saket. Cheers. Great. So before you all run, let me just remind you, I think it'll be a nice segue into our next session, which is at 3:30, in which we're going to hear a little bit more about AI. So I kind of purposefully moved away from it there because I think, as with a lot of these technology terms, AI is getting a lot of publicity, is getting a lot of hype, but I'm not sure necessarily many of us understand what it means in plain English. So we've got a session at 3:30. Please join us back here for that. One other housekeeping note. Please enjoy some free coffee outside, some of the best coffee in town. Actually, I would say the best coffee in town. Coffee is free, but if you want to make a contribution in dollars, pounds, yen, whatever you have, Swift will kindly match any donation made such that we can benefit some of the victims of the recent tragedies in Mexico, in fact, which were the worst in 3 decades. So thank you very much for that.